G'day everyone, how's it going? Another episode of Lubrication Experts today. My name's Rafe, and today I have Trevor Gauntlett returning. So my first returning guest, very exciting, back due to popular demand. So what I wanted to do today is discuss a pretty widely used base oil technology that maybe people aren't as familiar with. So it's the gas to liquid base oils, which are used pretty widely in the industry now. Predominantly manufactured by Shell, but available in products, across different brands, as we might get into a little bit later. Now, Trevor has a background. He spent most of his career at Shell, but I'll ask Trevor to explain his actual kind of understanding of this technology. So, Trevor, if you could please take us away.
Right. First thing is, I never worked in GTL when I was in Shell, and I am not going to give you any commercial secrets in this. I can absolutely guarantee that because I know nothing from within the company. However, way back in the 1980s, I did my PhD on Fischer-Tropsch chemistry, which is fundamental to the production of GTL. So I maintained an interest. Might seem very geeky. But even though I moved on to other stuff, including the chemistry behind metallocene PAOs, and this was way before I even joined the lubricants industry, I've maintained an interest in sort of like the chemistry that was prevalent in those kind of things. So I can give insights based on general stuff without any risk of ever having given away a Shell trade secret there.
Awesome. Yeah, you say extremely geeky. Well, extremely geeky is what we do here, almost exclusively. Right. So you're in very good company. Maybe just to start out, if we could maybe start with a bit of a history of kind of the GTL process. I use GTL in a very loose way. It's kind of an umbrella term, but would you be able to give a bit of a history on going back to who discovered the process and, maybe the way it was commercialized?
Yeah. So it started with fundamental studies on getting liquids away from out of coal. So in the 1920s, it depends on which references you read, whether it was 1923, 24, 25, or 26. A couple of guys called Fischer and Tropsch in Germany discovered and patented a process for the conversion of coal to hydrocarbon products. And they started with carbon monoxide and hydrogen, which you can get by many means. So, in the gas to liquids going through to base oils approach, you start with methane, so CH4, but you can start with biomass, and of course you can start with coal. And if you burn them in a slight absence of oxygen, you get carbon monoxide and hydrogen, which you then put into the Fischer-Tropsch process. And depending on the process conditions, you can get out fuels. And quite a few companies have done that. And if you run the process under slightly different conditions, you can get longer hydrocarbons, so you can get base oil length hydrocarbons. And if you adjust the conditions again, you can get oxygenates, usually alcohols, out of the process as well, because you start with carbon monoxide, you've got a carbon to oxygen bond. You can break it completely, or you can incorporate it into your chemistry. So that was the 1920s. In the 1930s, Germany preparing its war effort, one of the things that it realized was that it didn't have access to a great deal of crude oil. So there was a lot of manufacture in Germany in the 1930s and early 40s. South Africa facing economic sanctions due to apartheid. Developed from the 1950s onwards. So you've got Sasol, especially, was a major player in it. A company that's now called Petro SA, so the South African national oil company. And so when I came into the whole thing in the late 70s, early 80s, We were then onto a third thing, which was sort of reactions to the oil crisis that came out of the Arab-Israeli War in the 1970s. And that, I think, is where Shell came into the whole thing. And so you've got these different trains, which were all about the conversion of something into liquid hydrocarbons, and mainly for fuels. Shell in the 80s, 90s, they introduced the Shell middle distillate synthesis process, so SMDS. And interesting enough, they always used to get people within Shell who wanted to talk about an MSDS, so a material safety data sheet. They would refer to it as an SMDS. They, first of all, they took that on, it was on petroleum slack waxes. So straight out of solvent extraction, producing Group 1 base oils. And they started on the process of doing hydroisomerizations on slack waxes, and that was in Bintulu in Malaysia. And that then changed over to Fischer-Tropsch waxes sometime in the 1990s. And all of that effort then led into the business case for Pearl GTL in Qatar, which opened in 2011. And I think out of all the Fischer-Tropsch processes that are ongoing, which start with, say, methane and take it through to liquids, then the Pearl plant in Qatar is the only one that actually goes all the way through the base oils. There's another couple of plants, at least in Qatar, in which Sasol, so we get back to that company, is a joint venture partner, but they produce synthetic fuels and synthetic diesel. It's a very clean burn material if it's produced by Fischer-Tropsch, because it's a very well-defined molecular distribution as far as the fuel is concerned. And the same is true for the lubricants grades. So is that good enough for history?
Yeah, that's a really good history. I find it fascinating when you get that sort of intersection of technology, but also geopolitical pressure, right? So some of the changes that you just described, where it's, let's say, for example, like Germany pre-war, without access to fuel resources, having to look to create their own. South Africa during the apartheid regime, unable to import anything. So again, having to look to technology to solve that problem. I find that interesting that people have been using this technology as a bit of a workaround for their own country's, let's say, like limitations at the time. And that, just the way that spurs, I guess, innovation. But before we get into maybe the production of lubricant base oil specifically, I just wanted to back up a little bit, because like we said from the outset, GTL is kind of this umbrella term that encompasses a whole bunch of different technologies, which some of them you described as, let's say, for example, producing synthetic diesel. Are there, what are some of the other common products that we would make out of a gas to liquid process as well?
Okay. Gas to liquids is an umbrella that goes way beyond taking methane out the ground and producing hydrocarbons. So there's two things. First of all, gas to liquids, and then we'll talk about Fischer-Tropsch, which is one of three steps in the production of a GTL base oil. So gas to liquids can include things like the conversion of methane, a gas, to methanol. And you've got a background with Mobil. Well, I think it was probably in the 1980s, Mobil produced a process with their amazing zeolite called ZSM5, which in my catalyst days was like the gold standard of everything to do with petrochemical processing. And that's a simple conversion of methane to methanol. So in terms of the chemistry, you take CH4 and you add a single oxygen in there and you get CH3 and then the alcohol group OH. You also get processes, and these are now coming into the production of sustainable aviation fuel, which might not even be petrochemical or chemical, but it could be biochemical. And the conversion of, say, carbon dioxide, which can be just harvested from the air, into ethanol. And this is a step that there's a few companies in there, but the one that sort of sticks in my mind is a company that was founded in New Zealand called LanzaTech. I think they're now an American company. And they take carbon dioxide and convert that to ethanol. And then that ethanol, so that's two carbons together now, is then converted into aviation kerosene. So you're up with a carbon number of 12, 15, 18 or so. And they've got processes now approved for 50-50 mixing of the aviation kerosene at the end of that into commercial jet, if you're in the States, or jet A1 fuel for most of the rest of the world. And again, that's a gas to liquids process, and that one even ends up with a hydrocarbon, but it's not Fischer-Tropsch. There are also competing Fischer-Tropsch chemistries to produce aviation kerosene. Again, synthetic aviation kerosene, and because it starts with some kind of waste, carbon monoxide or something that is burned to produce carbon monoxide, then gives the sustainability element to it. Yeah. And so Fischer-Tropsch chemistry, which starts with carbon monoxide and hydrogen. As I've said, you've got still companies in South Africa making mainly synthetic diesel, but you can use it to make aviation kerosene. And also in Qatar, certainly I've mentioned the Sasol joint ventures there already. It can be used to make alcohols, and that comes down to possibly some of the limitations over why can't you make certain grades for lubricants applications. And so Fischer-Tropsch chemistry, as I say, starts with carbon monoxide and hydrogen, and it winds up making you, as far as we are concerned, nice hydrocarbons at the end of it, which we can use as very nice base oil.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting, and I guess the reason I wanted to back up and just briefly talk about a range of technologies is obviously everyone's sort of taking the sustainability angle at the moment, and some of the products that you've just described, whether it's synthetic aviation fuel, as an example, there is no foreseeable replacement for jet fuel on the horizon. I know people are talking about hydrogen in kind of the distant future, so that could become a really important technology. And you also mentioned the production of methanol from methane as well. And we've seen a lot of announcements, especially over the last 12 months, of all the marine companies wanting to get into the methanol combustion or the ammonia combustion game. So again, we're going to have to find renewable, sustainable ways of producing those too. So just wanted to kind of back up there a little bit. So if we go back to what's really the core discussion today, which is producing lubricant base oils through the GTL, specifically Fischer-Tropsch process, which is, again, primarily the domain of the Pearl GTL plant. Would you be able to just, I know you have the PhD in this one, but for us casuals, as you might call them, would you be able to break down the process for us?
Yeah, and there's 3 steps to the process. Number 1 is that you take the methane and you react it with oxygen, and this is one of the significant things, right? There's a lot of stuff being thrown at Shell about this. This is an incredibly energy intensive process. So your methane comes out of the ground, and if you're going to purify it, you've got to liquefy it. So you've got to cool it down a lot. Takes a lot of energy. You react it. You could make it react with air, but then you've got nitrogen around, you've got high temperatures, you start to produce NOx. Hey, we're into typical lubricant combustion conditions, what you're going to deal with. So you liquefy your oxygen as well. So that also involves a lot of energy to cool stuff down, which then goes into a reactor that gets hot. So there's a lot of energy management there, but your carbon monoxide, your methane is combusted to produce carbon monoxide and hydrogen. Now, the nice thing about methane combustion is that you've got just then the right amounts of carbon monoxide and hydrogen to then go on to stage 2. So having broken everything up, you then put it back together. And that's stage 2. And stage 2, essentially, as far as we are concerned, produces hydrocarbon waxes, and very, very nice ones as well, because they are highly linear. Now, of course, the smaller molecules, they float off or get distilled off and they become fuel. You also get an awful lot of propane, ethane, etc. Good stuff for further chemical processes. And if you tweak the process, you can even make them into olefins, which are even better from the point of view of going on to petrochemical processes. So they all get siphoned off and we're left with our wax. Now, wax isn't a great lubricant. So you then go through, again, another industry standard process now, anyway, some kind of hydroisomerization process. Now, of course, there's a whole set of proprietary trade names around the process. And I may inadvertently use one of those names and that will be a complete accident, because the Shell process I think is their own, but basically you take a linear molecule, which is a bit like a snake, and you give it a couple of legs by moving some stuff around on it, and so you'll wind up giving a couple of side chains, and this then means that your substance, which was a wax because you could get all your individual molecules would just lie down together and become solid at relatively high temperatures. They have little stubby bits off the sides, so it's a bit like a snake, but it's got a few legs. They don't come together as a solid so easily, so your pour point drops or your low temperature properties improve, they continue to flow. And that's absolutely critical, and it's something that's true of all group 3s anyway, that you've got some kind of hydro finishing process. I really don't like the word hydro cracking, because as a chemist, cracking means breaking things up, and you're not doing that, you're rearranging it. So hydroisomerization, which is isomerization is a proper chemical word for taking a molecule and rearranging it, but still leaving it with the same chemical formula, is much more important. And that's hydroisomerization, or that final finishing step, the isomerization process, is what then gives you the GTL fluid, the group 3 plus super high viscosity index type properties that I'm sure you're going to want to ask questions about now.
Yeah, well, I mean, that kind of leads nicely into the next question I was going to ask, which was really around performance properties. So we've already touched a little bit on how by going from a straight carbon chain to something that's a bit more branched, you're obviously improving the pour point, and so it doesn't form what are effectively solid particles, right? When we get down to cold temperatures, but what are the kind of basic performance properties that you expect out of a GTL?
Well, it's to use the marketing term, it's a group 3 plus, because you've got viscosity indices now up above 140. The low temperature properties are excellent, not quite PAO. But I do remember the time within in my Shell days. I mean, there's not going to be any kind of secret on this one. So like the celebrations when the plant in Qatar was able to produce products that meant zero W's could be blended reliably, and that they weren't completely trashing the yield, because you've always got this balance in a chemical plant between improved performance and reduced yield. And they managed to find a set of process conditions, which then meant, we can get the VI up, the low temperature properties down, such that we can make a zero W without resorting to any kind of PAO trim. And that was relatively early on in the process, but certainly when the process started, the VIs that were coming out weren't capable of that. And so if you were going to produce, obviously the challenges that came after Pearl were around sort of 0W16, 0W8, 0W12. Those kinds of fluids couldn't have been made from the original Pearl material. You've now got excellent low temperature properties, and as far as the crankcase is concerned, then certainly you can do these 0WX formulations very well. Some PAO people will say, well, a GTL doesn't quite have the same kind of performance as a PAO in, say, slow cool applications. So maybe wind turbine lubricants and transmissions, there's still a little bit there. But they're going to outperform the vast majority of Group 3s that come out of petrochemical refining. That's just there on the spec sheet. You can see it. Yeah. Mainly, you just have to look at VI. But then you look at pour points as well, and they're generally lower than the vast majority of Group 3 products that are on the market. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about sort of like that, the yield, not problem, but the yield trade-off, right? In a lot of these chemical processes, right, where you can maybe sharpen the pencil on the process, but the yield goes down. I'm assuming that that's also true of the Group 3s, right? So if you were to hydrotreat them to a more significant degree, you can improve the quality of that Group 3. Is the reason that GTL is so successful is just that it can hit that yield at a better price point, hit that yield and those properties at a better price point than a very, very, very highly refined Group 3? Or are there physical limitations around how much you can actually refine a mineral base oil, and it will, no matter how much you try, it'll never get to GTL quality?
I think it's more of the former.
Okay.
I don't think there's physical limitations because you can take a petroleum wax and it can wind up being compositionally pretty well the same as a Fischer-Tropsch wax. Mm. There are some advantages in the Fischer-Tropsch wax because they are so linear, but you could really screw your yield and take your petroleum waxes and get them to the point where you've got 99.9% of super linear molecules, all of about the same length. It's just a lot easier to do by the Fischer-Tropsch process. Okay. So there is a little bit about. So I'm going to correct myself there. there's certainly a little bit about a Fischer-Tropsch wax is a more reliable, a more reproducible material than, say, a petroleum wax overall. Okay. I can hear the sort of the calls from the Group 3 producers saying, no, you're misrepresenting us here already. And then the key thing was that these sort of cracking of bottles of champagne and things like that was that the Shell guys found a set of process conditions that meant that any hydrogen process that involves a hydrocarbon, you've got two competing reactions. You've got probably what you want to do, and you've got chopping it up. And you really don't want to chop things up because generally the smaller the molecule, the less the value. And so, your hydroisomerization process, you've got a competing side reaction there, which is the actual cracking process where the hydrogen breaks a carbon-carbon bond forever. Now, in isomerization, you're moving carbon-carbon bonds within the molecule, but that can be really quite difficult, and so some bits fall off. So yeah, there's a lot of process and chemical engineering that goes into that kind of process and the technology, and it's very, very, it's a very important part of it. So I think I've diverted myself away from your question a little bit. No. But it's certainly, I think the Fischer-Tropsch wax is a very, very good starting material. And then, somebody may find a way of optimizing their processes with petroleum waxes to be able to get to the point of producing as good a product, but it will be a very expensive product. And I think that's where you come down to the whole thing about what's the market prepared to pay for. And Shell's got this world scale plant producing, this kind of quality. It's going to be difficult for other people to come in at the moment, from what you can see that's in the market, with a similar product at a comparable price.
Yeah. Yep. So something you touched on there was the idea of, in the engine oil space, of like the 0W grades. I've obviously come from a bit more of an industrial background, where our understanding is that GTL is used in many products, but it seems like it's confined mostly to some of the lower viscosity grades. Or at least that's my perception. So you'll need to correct me if that's not true. But if that is true and it's only available in sort of those lower viscosity grades, what's the limitation there? Is that, can't we just allow the reaction to continue and make larger and larger molecules to get ourselves to something heavier? What's the limitation around
that? Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, you get into the whole thing about competing reactions in your reactor. Yes, you can, in principle, just let the reaction go along, and because in the classic catalyst image, which I've got on page, I don't know what it is, of my PhD thesis. You've got all these little carbons sitting on the surface, and they also suddenly decide to join up. And become a carbon chain, which then floats away from the surface, and hey ho, isn't it all very simple? And you can do that, but there's a couple of things that potentially are going to get in the way. Number one, you don't stop at say 60 or 65 or whatever you need for a nice heavy grade, lubricant that's going to be, say, an ISO 320 or something like that. It actually goes on and on and on, and you get coking on your catalyst. So that's one of the other things. And then the other thing is that in the process, the received wisdom in the literature is that you go to a higher pressure to try and produce larger molecules. But at higher pressures, the Fischer-Tropsch process itself takes a slightly different route. And you then you don't favor the production of alcohols, but you start to produce more of them anyway. And then you've got a separation problem. So that's all chemical literature, right? So no Shell insight in that at all. In fact, I'll probably get told that I'm wrong. But if you go back and you have a look, you will find productions by publications by Shell where they were, in the early noughties, finessing the idea of higher viscosity products. So again, my interpretation of this is that it's just not worth it. You just don't produce enough good quality material quickly. And of course, you've also got this issue that you're trying to run a continuous process. Once you've got it in its sweet spot, you want to run it there all the time. So it's not like a batch process where, you'll produce an ISO 320, this week and next week you're producing, an ISO 32 or something like that. There's an awful lot of waste that would go into that kind of switching. So if they were going to produce a lot of material, or if they were going to produce a heavy grade consistently, they'd have to have an assurance that there was going to be a market for it. And there just didn't appear to be that kind of market. You've got thousands and thousands of tons of 4 centi-stoke and 5 centi-stoke material that you can, you've got a ready market for. Yeah, but if you're also tweak your process and you're producing 10% of that that's suitable for an ISO 320 or a 460 or something like that gear oil, there's just not the market for that Group 3 quality, those volumes. So almost certainly the economic decision was taken. It's not worth running our process where we're producing all this heavy base oil because we don't think we can sell it. So
that makes
so
sense.
they optimize around the 4 and the 5 because that's where they've got a market.
Yeah. Yep. That certainly makes sense. And the outsider's impression that I get is that the GTL market is in some ways almost like oversubscribed. Shell could produce more and they would just sell more. That's the impression that I get anyway. And so, if you're in that position, then there is no incentive, I guess, to go to a higher viscosity grade. Like you said, if the market's not necessarily there, and if that high viscosity grade is already filled by the likes of the heavier PAOs as well.
And I think that's important because, of course, at the time that Shell was making all of these investment decisions as well, metallocene PAO arrived. And you weren't suddenly in the passenger car motor oil market in particular, you were basically putting in a product just below PAO. And over the years, sort of tweaking it up and getting it right up. But of course, you were coming in at tier 2. In the industrial envelope, the GTL product would have been coming in, once metallocene PAO arrived, would have been coming in at tier 3. And then you've got the issue about, how are you going to exploit that? Where's your margin going to be? So it's a good prompt there because don't think I articulated that one very well at all. But I think the arrival of metallocene PAO in the heavier grades in the industrial area would also have been a significant disincentive for Shell and any other GTL player. But maybe we'll come on to why is Shell the only one in a short while. Anyone who was trying to make heavy Group 3s, you just didn't have it because you were only ever going to come in at the third tier of fluids. So where was your margin going to come from when you're not even as good as the original PAOs, and suddenly there's something on top of that, in the metallocenes.
Yeah. Well, and to be honest, that was actually the next question I was going to ask you was around it seems like such a good and robust technology, and in an era where gas is reasonably plentiful, may not feel like it right at this very moment with the context of Russia and Ukraine, but on a 10-year timescale, gas was reasonably plentiful, and of course Qatar being either the first or the second largest gas producer, or LNG producer at least in the world, makes sense to have Pearl GTL there. So in that context, it is almost surprising to me that Shell is the only one who does seem to be pursuing not GTL, because as you have already mentioned, there are other companies doing GTLs in the likes of synthetic fuels and that, but specifically lubricant base stocks from the GTL process. It seems that Shell basically has this market to themselves. So, yeah, why is that? Why is there only really one player? Whereas, for example, when you talked about metallocene PAOs, there are not many players, but there are more than one. So what is it about GTL that makes it unique?
Geopolitics and finance, probably. Because you got to remember when all the final investment decisions were being made. They were being made towards the end of the noughties. So the financial crash came along. Now, the quoted numbers, I mean, in Qatar, there was going to be at least a Chevron plant. And Sasol were looking at it. There's 2 Chevron Sasol joint ventures in Qatar that produce fuels. And I'm sure ExxonMobil's name was mentioned there as well. And there's a whole host of Chinese coal to liquids type activities as well. But they are, I think some of them are now going. But certainly if you look back into the noughties, companies were coming to make their final investment decisions just at the time of the financial crash. And the quoted numbers for the Sasol plant were 13 to 15, so 13 to 15 billion US dollars in terms of capital expenditure. And I don't think the numbers for Chevron and for ExxonMobil were much different. So certainly that was a significant issue. And then, of course, the other thing was that in that period, again in the late noughties, the US suddenly discovered shale. And I think a lot of money then sort of, if you like, got reshored back to North America, given that we're talking about a lot of North American corporations here, and was invested in shale, and therefore the production of ethylene, and then onto linear alpha olefins and PAOs, at least as far as the lubricant space is concerned. Obviously, there's a lot more than just that. But shale gas, tight gas, etc., we tend to just say shale. It's not all shale gas. But suddenly, the US found itself with enormous amounts of hydrocarbons and the ability to realize those. And so competing expenditure priorities at a time of tight cash meant that, that the other companies blinked, decided to go and spend their money elsewhere, however you want to say it. But that was basically parts of the reason why Shell then just wound up being by itself in this market.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And maybe just a follow-up question to that then, because obviously there is if anyone wanted to enter the market now, there is the huge upfront capex that would be required. And I don't know that anyone really has the appetite for that kind of investment now. And on top of that, you've already mentioned that Shell has been sharpening the pencil on the process to refine it and to optimize it. So do you think, realistically, anyone could enter the market at this point? Because they'd be at this point, they're at least 10, 15 years behind on the technology.
Well, I've mentioned that there's coal to liquids in China. I'm having a little mental block about the names of the companies that were mentioned to do that. But again, the thing about coal to liquids, if you go right back to the start, and I was talking about the chemical processes, burning methane produces the right amount of carbon monoxide and hydrogen for a Fischer-Tropsch process. Burning coal doesn't, because coal is much more carbon than hydrogen. So you've got to have an external source of hydrogen. Now, okay, potentially, of course, you could have green hydrogen, but hey, green hydrogen is going to solve everything in the world. We've only got to produce about 1 billion times more than we do at the moment. So, but we're not going to that at the moment. So there are certainly those kinds of processes, and as I mentioned before, then Fischer-Tropsch is being used in sustainable aviation fuel, and where it's being used in sustainable aviation fuel at the moment is in things like taking municipal solid waste, burning it, and then converting the combustion gases into something useful. Now, it's not necessarily the best way of processing municipal solid waste. The ideal way would be to separate it and then take out your individual plastics and try to reuse them rather than burning them and starting again. But it's certainly a good way forward. Now, with that kind of market, which is only going to grow, it's going to get away from the niche of sustainable aviation fuel and move into things that are more broad, and you're going to be producing more and different hydrocarbons basically by processing the combustion products from waste. And that'll do several things. It addresses potentially things like single-use plastics. It addresses sending stuff to landfill, like in the UK, we send a lot of stuff, doesn't go into landfill in our own country, it gets shipped abroad, which is not very good for your ESG, so your environmental, social, and governance credentials. And so, assuming that we do actually get out of COVID, and we don't have a third world war, then these things are going to be, relevant. They were relevant pre-COVID. Their relevance is only being enhanced with COVID. But whether anybody will actually get to producing something that's base oils is a really difficult thing, and I would tend towards the no. The processes are there to produce hydrocarbons. At least when you produce hydrocarbons that you can combust, then you're reducing your CO2 footprint by 50%. Well, let's say 30, 40%, because you've got the amount of energy that's been involved in processing the municipal solid waste to get to kerosene or gasoline or whatever it may be. But that's what the aviation industry is saying. Look, we can go through this process and we can get roughly a 50% reduction in our carbon intensity simply by having these sustainable aviation fuels, because they were carbon dioxide. Once they were converted by plants into something, we used it, but then we didn't just put it back into carbon dioxide. We took whatever that was and turned it back into kerosene. So I think that GTL Fischer-Tropsch is only going to be fuels related, and there's not going to be a lot of additional movement into that space. And one of the other things is you've got other technologies that are coming that may get into that space anyway. So Novi first came along with their sugar cellulose based process, and they started, we're going to make something PAO like. It's come back to Group 3, and they're using Chevron Lummus Global's hydro processing, because I can't remember the trade name, as their finishing step. So you're going to get high quality Group 3s that come from different directions, and maybe that kind of Novi type approach is going to get there. Or maybe Neste, even they've got a process that produces it's called My Renewable Diesel, or MY Renewable Diesel. In theory, that could also be extended out towards renewable Group 3 Plus type base stocks. So whether the gas to liquids would ever come against that kind of competition, where you might wind up with bio-derived products in the same performance space, I think is questionable.
Yeah. Well, Trevor, that seems like a really good place to end it. Just with a
Okay.
discussion on the future of the technology. It feels like the discussion that we had today almost had like two different through lines. One of which was, the technology as it relates to lubricant base stocks, but also the technology as it relates to kind of broader fuels and liquids and its potential applications in sustainable liquids as well. So I think
Yeah.
those two parallel discussions were are really, really interesting. And I think the audience will get a lot from that. So really appreciate your insight, Trevor. Thanks for agreeing to return.
Right.
And I'll have to get you back for round 3.
Oh, well, we'll have to decide on the subject there. Okay, thanks very much.
All right.